Legendary voices have a way of breaking through the noise of the world. And in the first trembling seconds of this story, you can almost hear one of them cracking, a familiar voice softened by age and sorrow, whispering that some truths are so heavy they bend even the strongest hearts. That voice belongs to Morgan Freeman. And on a rain-soaked evening in Los Angeles, long after the cameras had gone dark, he sat across from Pierce Brosnan in a quiet room that smelled faintly of old books and coffee, and said he could not carry this secret anymore. Pierce had just turned 72, his hair silvered but his eyes still carrying that gentle fire that once made him James Bond. And he listened with the kind of stillness that only comes from a man who has lived enough to know when a moment will change everything. Morgan's hands were shaking slightly as he held a folded piece of paper, a letter he had kept hidden for decades, a letter that carried the name Rob Reiner in ink that had faded with time, but not with meaning. Outside, thunder rolled like a distant applause, and for a moment Pierce wondered if the world itself was bracing for what was about to be said. They had known Rob for most of their lives, not just as a director, not just as a storyteller, but as a man who laughed loudly and loved fiercely, a man who could light up a room with a joke and then quietly step aside to let others shine. He had given the world unforgettable films, stories about love and friendship and the ache of being human. And yet behind that warm creative genius, there had been something else, something that Morgan now felt was poisoning his own soul by being kept silent. Pierce leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper, and asked what kind of truth could make a man like Morgan Freeman look so afraid. Morgan closed his eyes, and when he opened them there were tears sitting there, stubbo, RN and bright. He said it began years ago on a set where everyone was laughing, where Jack Nicholson was telling one of his wild stories and Diane Keaton was teasing him the way only she could, and Rob Reiner was standing a little apart, smiling but not really present. Morgan had noticed it then, that slight shadow behind Rob's eyes, the way he would sometimes step away from the noise and stare at nothing as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. At the time, Morgan thought it was just the weight of genius, the exhaustion of always being the one who had to hold the story together. But the years passed, and the shadow grew. Rob began to withdraw, canceling dinners, missing calls from old friends like Tom Hanks and Billy Crystal, men who had once been like brothers to him. There were whispers in Hollywood, the kind that travel quietly through back rooms and late-night phone calls, about Rob being ill, about something in his body and something in his mind both slowly betraying him. Morgan had visited him once during that period, and he still remembered how Rob had tried to joke about it, how he had said that even a storyteller can run out of words sometimes, and laughed in a way that made Morgan's chest ache. Pierce listened, his own memories rising like ghosts. He remembered running into Rob at a charity event years earlier, how Rob had hugged him a little too tightly and said, almost pleading, that he missed the old days when everyone was together, when the world felt simpler. Pierce had felt then that something was wrong, but he had been busy, swept up in his own projects, his own family struggles, his own quiet fears about getting older in a business that worships youth. Now, sitting here with Morgan, he felt a deep, cold regret for not having asked more questions. Morgan unfolded the letter at last, his fingers tracing the creases as if they were scars. He said Rob had written it during one of his darkest moments, when the illness that was slowly eating at him had left him in pain and confusion, when he was afraid he would lose not just his health but his memory, his identity, everything that made him Rob Reiner. In that letter, Rob had confessed to something he had never told anyone else, something that had haunted him for decades, something that connected all of them in a way that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The room felt smaller as Morgan spoke, as if the walls were leaning in to hear. He told Pierce that Rob had believed he had hurt someone deeply many years ago, not with his hands, but with his silence, with a choice he made when the stakes were high and the pressure from the studio and the industry was crushing. A choice that involved another beloved figure, someone whose name still carried weight and warmth in Hollywood, someone whose career had never quite recovered from a sudden mysterious fall. Morgan did not say the name yet, but Pierce felt his stomach tighten because in this town, every fall has 1,000 hidden stories behind it. Rob had written that he was sorry, not just to that person, but to everyone who had been affected by the ripple of that one moment. He wrote about the guilt that had followed him through every success, every award, every standing ovation, how he would smile on the outside while inside he was still that younger man, standing in a hallway, making a decision he knew would change a life. Morgan's voice broke as he read those words aloud, because he had loved Rob, and loving someone who is drowning in regret is its own kind of quiet torture. Pierce reached out and put his hand over Morgan's, feeling the tremor there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Pierce thought of his Al. He said the name at last, softly, almost with reverence, a name that had once been spoken with nothing but admiration and love. It was a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Rob Reiner in the early days, a man whose laughter had filled sound stages and whose talent had made audiences believe in magic. Pierce felt a chill run through him as he recognized it, because this was someone everyone thought they knew, someone whose quiet disappearance from the spotlight had always been explained away as bad luck or changing tastes. Morgan said Rob had been given a choice back then, one that would protect the studio, the investors, the fragile illusion that kept the industry running, but would cost that man everything. In the letter, Rob had written about sitting in a closed-door meeting with powerful executives, men whose faces were never on posters, but whose words could end careers with a nod. They told him that if he spoke up, if he defended his friend against a false accusation that was spreading like poison, the film they were making would be shut down, millions would be lost, and dozens of people would be out of work. Rob had been young and terrified, still trying to prove himself, still hungry for a future he could barely imagine losing. So he had stayed silent, and in that silence, a lie became the truth. The man at the center of it all had been quietly pushed aside, his projects canceled, his calls unanswered. Friends who once adored him began to look away, afraid of being pulled down with him. Morgan remembered seeing him at a party years later, standing alone with a drink in his hand, his eyes tired and confused, as if he could not understand how his world had collapsed so completely. Morgan had wanted to say something then, had wanted to ask what really happened, but the weight of Hollywood's unspoken rules had kept his mouth shut. Pierce felt a deep ache in his chest as he listened, thinking about how many lives in this industry had been shaped not by talent or effort, but by fear and silence. He thought about his own battles, the way grief had followed him after the loss of his wife, the way he had learned how easily the world could look away from your pain if it was inconvenient. He realized that what Morgan was describing was not just a betrayal, but a kind of slow murder of someone's spirit. Morgan said Rob had carried that guilt like a shadow for the rest of his life. Every time he stood on a set, every time he heard applause, there was a voice in his head reminding him of the friend he had abandoned. As the illness took hold, as his body weakened and his memory began to blur, that voice only grew louder. Rob had told Morgan that in the quiet hours of the night, when the pain was worst, he would see that man's face and hear him asking why, and Rob had no answer that could make it right. The hospital room where Rob had spent his last days had been small and softly lit, the kind of place where time feels suspended. Morgan had visited him often, reading to him, talking about old films, trying to keep his mind anchored to the world he loved. Pierce could almost picture it, the two old friends sitting together, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the faint smell of disinfectant, holding on to memories like lifelines. Rob had been weaker then, his once booming voice reduced to a fragile whisper, but his eyes were still sharp when he spoke about the past. He had told Morgan that he was afraid to die with this secret still buried, afraid that the lie he had helped create would become the only story left behind. He had asked Morgan to promise to tell the truth, even if it meant tearing down the comforting myths people held about him. Morgan had hesitated, knowing the storm it would bring, but he had also seen the desperation in Rob's face, the way a dying man clings to the hope of redemption. Pierce felt tears sting his own eyes, thinking about how often people wait too long to say what really matters. He thought of the countless conversations he had postponed, the apologies he had never given, the love he had sometimes assumed would always have time to be spoken. Hearing about Rob's last days made him feel both grateful and deeply sad, grateful that Rob had at least tried to set something right, and sad that it had taken the edge of death to give him the courage to do it. Morgan folded the letter again, his hand steady now, as if speaking these words had eased something inside him. He said that what hurt most was not just what Rob had done, but how many of them had played their own small parts in the silence. How the entire community had looked away while a good man was destroyed by a lie. Pierce knew he was right, and that knowledge felt like a weight pressing down on his heart. Outside, the storm had begun to fade, leaving the city washed and quiet. But inside the room the air was still heavy with unspoken grief. Pierce could sense that this truth was only the first layer of something much deeper, something that would force them all to confront not just Rob Reiner's choices, but their own. And as Morgan took another slow breath, preparing to go even further into the darkness of this story, it was clear that there was no turning back now that Morgan's voice dropped even lower, as if he were afraid the walls themselves might be listening. And Pierce felt a strange, almost childish urge to look over his shoulder to make sure they were truly alone. There was something about this confession that carried the weight of too many years, too many buried memories, and it seemed to thicken the air around them. Morgan said that after Rob's death, he had tried to push the promise aside, telling himself that maybe it was kinder to let the past remain untouched. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rob in that hospital bed, his face pale, his breath shallow, his hand gripping Morgan's with surprising strength as he begged not to be forgotten for the wrong reasons. The man who had been destroyed by that old lie had never fully recovered, even though the world had moved on. He had drifted from project to project, his once bright star slowly dimming until it was barely visible. There were nights, Morgan said, when he would hear from mutual friends that this man was struggling, battling his own demons, trying to hold on to some sense of worth in an industry that had quietly labeled him damaged goods. The thought that Rob's silence had helped push him, there was something Rob had never been able to forgive himself for. Pierce remembered seeing that man on television once, years after his fall, being interviewed with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had spoken about gratitude and moving forward, but there had been an undercurrent of sadness, as if he were still waiting for something that would never come. Pierce had admired his resilience at the time, never knowing the full story behind it. Now, hearing Morgan's words, he felt a wave of anger and sorrow wash over him. Anger at the cruelty of a system that could discard people so easily, and sorrow for a life quietly broken that Rob's illness had been a slow, cruel thief. At first, it was just fatigue, a fog that made it harder to focus, but then came the pain, the nights when he couldn't sleep, the days when he forgot simple things. He had told Morgan once that losing his memory scared him more than dying, because his memories were his stories, the only way he knew how to be alive. As his condition worsened, he began to talk more and more about the past, about mistakes he wished he could erase, about friendships he had let slip away. One afternoon, not long before the end, Rob had asked Morgan to bring Pierce's name into the conversation. He had said he trusted Pierce, that there was something about his quiet strength and the way he carried both fame and grief that made him feel safe. Rob had wanted Pierce to hear the truth too, to understand what had happened and why, because he believed Pierce would know how to hold it with care. When Morgan repeated those words now, Pierce felt a strange mix of honor and heartbreak, realizing that even in his final days, Rob had been thinking about who might help him leave the world a little more honestly. Pierce spoke then, his voice unsteady, and said that Rob had once told him how much he admired Pierce's ability to survive loss without becoming bitter. Pierce had laughed it off at the time, not wanting to show how deeply the pain of losing his wife had scarred him, but now he understood that Rob had been searching for something he himself did not have, a way to live with regret without being destroyed by it. Pierce confessed that there were days when the grief still felt unbearable, when he would wake up and reach for someone who was no longer there, and that hearing about Rob's hidden torment made him feel less alone in his own. Morgan nodded, his eyes softening, and said that was why this story mattered, not just as a shocking revelation, but as a reminder of how fragile and interconnected they all were. He said Rob's family had felt the weight of his guilt too, even if they never knew its full source. His children had watched their father become quieter, more withdrawn, carrying a sadness he never quite explained. In the final weeks, when Rob could barely speak, he had looked at them with a kind of aching love, as if he were trying to apologize for something they would never fully understand. Pierce imagined those final moments, a family gathered around. A man who had given so much to the world, yet felt he had failed in one of the most important ways. He thought about how many families in Hollywood lived with similar unspoken stories, how the glamour often hid wounds that never healed. He felt tears slide down his cheeks, not just for Rob, but for everyone who had been hurt by that one moment of silence all those years ago. Morgan said that telling this truth would not bring the fallen man back to his former glory, nor would erase the pain Rob had caused, but it was a chance, however small, to acknowledge what had happened and to honor the suffering that had been ignored. He said that was what Rob had wanted, not forgiveness, but honesty. Pierce took a long, shaky breath, feeling the enormity of what they were doing, knowing that once these words were out in the world, they could never be taken back. The room felt heavy with memory and emotion, as if every ghost of their shared past was sitting with them, listening. Pierce could sense that they were moving closer to something even more painful, something that would force him to confront his own place in this tangled web of truth and silence. And as Morgan prepared to reveal the final pieces of Rob's confession, the weight of it pressed down on them both like a storm that had yet to break. Pierce felt as though the years were folding in on themselves, the past and present bleeding together until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Morgan's eyes were distant now, fixed on a memory only he could see, and when he spoke again, there was a quiet urgency in his voice, like a man racing against time. He said that Rob's final confession went even deeper than the betrayal itself, that there was a layer of pain beneath it that almost no one had ever known. Rob had written about the night he made that fateful choice, how he had gone home afterward and sat alone in the dark, unable to shake the feeling that something inside him had broken. He had tried to drown it in work, in success, in the applause of strangers, but the guilt had only grown heavier. Over the years, it had crept into his relationships, creating a distance between him and the people he loved most. Morgan said Rob believed that the illness which later took him was somehow connected to that long-carried stress, that the body can only hold so much shame before it begins to collapse under its weight. Pierce felt a cold knot form in his stomach, thinking about how often people ignore the quiet warnings of their own hearts. He remembered times when he himself had chosen the easier path instead of the right one, small compromises that seemed harmless in the moment but lingered long after. Hearing about Rob's belief that his guilt had literally made him sick was terrifying and strangely familiar, as if it were a lesson written in blood. Rob had told Morgan that in his darkest hours he would think about Pierce too, about how Pierce had faced public tragedy with a kind of graceful honesty that Rob himself had never managed. He envied Pierce's willingness to let the world see his pain, to admit that he was hurting. Rob had hidden behind jokes and projects, never letting anyone see how deeply he was haunted. Pierce's eyes filled with tears as he heard this, because he knew how hard it had been to be that open, how close he had come to retreating into himself just as Rob had. There was another name in Rob's letter, another figure from their shared Hollywood past, someone who had been there when everything went wrong. This person had known the truth from the beginning, but had chosen, like Rob, to stay quiet. Morgan did not say whether this person was still alive, that the weight of that shared secret had followed them both like a curse. Pierce felt a surge of anger at the idea that more than one person had let an innocent man fall, and yet he also felt the complicated empathy that comes from knowing how fear can twist even good people into doing terrible things. Morgan described Rob's final days in more detail now, his voice soft and reverent. The illness had left him weak and often confused, but there were moments of startling clarity when he would suddenly speak with the old fire, recounting scenes from his films or telling stories about friends like Billy Crystal and Tom Hanks, laughing as if he were back on set again. In those moments, Morgan could almost forget how sick he was. But then the pain would return, and with it the sadness, and Rob would fall quiet, staring out the window as if watching something disappear in the distance. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, Rob had asked Morgan if he thought people could ever really make up for the worst things they had done. Morgan had told him that he didn't know, that sometimes all you could do was tell the truth and hope it mattered. Rob had nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks, and said that was all he wanted now, for the truth to matter, even if it came too late to save him. Pierce could barely speak as he absorbed all of this. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a vast, painful landscape, seeing for the first time the full scope of a tragedy that had been hidden in plain sight. He thought about the man who had been sacrificed to protect a lie, about Rob's family living with a sadness they never quite understood, about the countless films and stories that had been shaped by a decision made in fear. Morgan said that after Rob died, he had gone to the funeral and watched as the industry mourned a beloved director, praising his talent and his kindness, never knowing the full story of his inner torment. He had stood there, surrounded by familiar faces, and felt like he was holding a secret that was burning a hole in his chest. Pierce imagined him there, tall and dignified, carrying a truth that no one else could see, and felt a deep respect for the courage it must have taken to finally speak. The room was quiet again now, the kind of quiet that comes after something sacred has been revealed. Pierce felt both closer to Rob and further away from the simple, comforting version of him he had once known. He knew that what remained to be told would be the hardest part, the part that would force them to confront not just Rob's guilt, but the lasting damage it had done to everyone involved. The way Morgan looked at Pierce now was different, as if something inside him had finally given way, a dam cracking under years of pressure. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the truth beginning to show in his posture, and Pierce realized that telling this story was costing him something real. Morgan said there was one last piece of Rob's confession that he had struggled the most to share because it involved not just the past, but the present, not just a man who was gone, but people who were still alive and still pretending. Rob had written that before he died, he had tried to reach out to the man who had been destroyed by the lie. He had asked a mutual friend to pass along a message, a simple request to talk, to explain, to apologize. But the reply that came back was short and cold, filled with years of hurt that could not be erased by a few words. The man had said he was tired of old ghosts and broken promises, that whatever Rob had to say now would not give him back the life he had lost. Reading that part of the letter had shattered Rob, because it made him realize that some wounds remain open no matter how much time passes. Pierce closed his eyes, imagining the loneliness Rob must have felt in that moment, facing the reality that his chance for forgiveness might be gone forever. He thought about how many times people wait too long to say what matters, until the person they need to say it to no longer wants to hear it. That kind of regret, he knew, could hollow a person out from the inside. Morgan said Rob's family had noticed a change in him after that failed attempt. He became quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours staring at old photographs and letters. His children had asked him what was wrong, but he had only smiled weakly and told them he was just tired. In truth, he was carrying the unbearable knowledge that he might die without ever making things right. That sadness had followed him all the way to the hospital, where even as his body was failing, his mind was still wrestling with the past. Pierce felt his own heart aching in response, because he understood that desperate need for closure. He had felt it himself after his wife died, the endless list of things he wished he could still tell her, the conversations that would never happen. Hearing about Rob's final days made those old wounds throb again, a reminder that love and regret are often tangled together in ways that never fully unravel. Morgan said that in Rob's last clear moment, just hours before he slipped into a state of confusion that would never lift, he had looked at Morgan with a sudden, startling clarity. He had said that he was afraid people would remember him only for his films and not for the truth of who he was, a flawed man who had made a terrible mistake and had tried, too late, to face it. He had asked Morgan to make sure Pierce knew, because he believed Pierce would understand the cost of carrying grief and the courage it takes to finally speak. Tears streamed down Pierce's face now, unashamed. He felt a strange kinship with Rob, a connection forged not through their successes, but through their shared sense of loss and longing for redemption. He said quietly that if Rob were still here, he would want to tell him that being honest, even at the end, mattered more than any perfect reputation. Morgan nodded, his own eyes shining, and said he hoped Rob could somehow hear that. The truth, once spoken, seemed to echo in the room, touching every memory and every face that had been part of this story. Pierce could feel the enormity of it pressing against his chest. The realization that this confession was not just about one man's guilt, but about an entire culture of silence that had allowed so much pain to go unacknowledged. He knew that when this story finally reached the world, it would change how people looked at Rob Reiner, at the fallen star, and at Hollywood itself. The rain outside had stopped completely now, leaving the city washed and eerily calm, as if it too were waiting for what would come next. Pierce and Morgan sat together in that stillness, two aging men holding a truth that had been hidden for far too long, both of them aware that once it was fully released, nothing would ever be the same again. The quiet between them felt almost unbearable now, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that still lingered unspoken. Pierce wiped his eyes slowly, as if he were afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile space they were in. Morgan looked exhausted, like a man who had finally laid down a burden he had carried for far too long. Yet there was also a strange calm about him, the kind that comes after you have walked through the worst of a storm. He said that after Rob passed, there had been nights when he would sit alone in his house, listening to old recordings of Rob's Voice, bits of dialogue from films, interviews from happier days. In those moments, Rob sounded so alive, so full of humor and warmth, that it was almost impossible to reconcile that voice with the man who had died racked by illness and regret. Morgan would close his eyes and imagine Rob laughing again, free from the pain that had haunted him, and then he would remember the promise he had made, and the ache would return. Pierce confessed that he had often done the same with his late wife, replaying memories and old messages just to hear her voice, as if sound itself could keep someone alive a little longer. He said that grief has a way of turning even the smallest fragments into sacred relics. Hearing Morgan speak about Rob in that way made Pierce realize how deeply their friendship had been rooted in something more than professional respect. It had been built on shared dreams, shared fears, and a shared understanding of how lonely this life could be, even when you were surrounded by applause. Morgan said he had worried about Rob's family when he decided to finally tell the truth. He knew it might reopen wounds they had tried so hard to heal, might force them to see their father in a more complicated, painful light. But he also believed that hiding the truth forever would be another kind of betrayal, another way of denying Rob the chance to be seen as a whole human being rather than just a legend. Pierce nodded, understanding that sometimes honesty hurts precisely because it is real. There were moments when Morgan doubted himself, when he wondered if he was doing the right thing by bringing all of this into the open. He would think about the man whose life had been derailed by that long-ago lie, about the decades of struggle and quiet despair he had endured, and he would remind himself that even late justice is better than none at all. Pierce felt a surge of respect for Morgan's courage, because it takes a special kind of strength to risk your own reputation in order to tell a painful truth. As dawn began to creep into the sky outside, soft and pale, Pierce felt as though they had been sitting there for a lifetime. The night had carried them through layers of memory and emotion, stripping away the polished surfaces of their public lives and leaving behind something raw and deeply human. Pierce realized that he would never look at Rob Reiner's films in quite the same way again, knowing now the sorrow that had lived behind their creation. Morgan said quietly that he hoped the man who had been wronged would one day hear this story and know that at least one person had tried to make things right. He knew it would not erase the years of pain, but perhaps it could offer a small measure of acknowledgement, a recognition that what happened to him was not his fault. Pierce closed his eyes and silently wished the same, imagining that somewhere, somehow, that wounded soul might finally feel seen. The room was filled with a strange mixture of grief and relief now, as if something heavy had been lifted even though the scars remained. Pierce reached out and took Morgan's hand again, this time with a quiet firmness, a gesture of gratitude and solidarity. In that simple touch, there was an understanding that they were both changed by what had been shared, bound together by a truth that would never leave them. And as the first light of morning touched the windows, Pierce felt that they were standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, a future where this hidden story would finally have to face the world, and where the echoes of Rob's last confession would ripple far beyond this quiet room. The morning light had grown stronger now, filling the room with a soft, almost forgiving glow, and for a moment Pierce wondered if it was possible for the day itself to offer mercy. Morgan sat back in his chair, his face lined with exhaustion and a kind of quiet peace, as teach. Speaking Rob's truth had finally loosened a knot that had been tightening in his chest for years. Pierce could feel the weight of it too, not just as a listener, but as a man who had been invited into the most fragile, sacred part of another human being's story. Pierce spoke softly, his voice thick with emotion, and said that Rob Reiner had always been known for telling stories about love, loyalty, and the complicated beauty of being human. Now he understood that those stories had come from a place of deep inner conflict, from a man who knew all too well how easy it is to fail the people you care about, and how hard it is to live with that failure. Morgan nodded, his eyes closing briefly, as if he were seeing Rob again, younger and full of hope, before fear and guilt had carved their marks in him. They talked about the man who had been hurt, about the long, lonely road he had walked after being pushed out of the spotlight. Pierce said he hoped that one day, somehow, he would find peace, whether or not he ever chose to forgive. Morgan agreed, saying that forgiveness is not something anyone can demand, only something that sometimes grows on its own, like a fragile plant pushing through cracked ground. What mattered most now was that the truth was no longer trapped in the dark, slowly poisoning everyone who touched it. Pierce felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He knew that by hearing this confession, he had become part of its story, part of Rob's final attempt to be honest. He promised Morgan that he would carry it with care, that he would never turn it into gossip or spectacle, but would always remember the human suffering at its heart. Morgan's eyes glistened with gratitude, because that was all Rob had ever wanted in the end, to be understood, not judged from a distance, as they stood to leave. The world outside seemed almost too ordinary. Cars moving, people rushing to work, unaware of the heavy, beautiful, painful truth that had just been shared in that quiet room. Pierce paused at the door and looked back at Morgan, feeling a deep respect for the courage it takes to finally speak when silence has become unbearable. Morgan gave him a small, tired smile, the kind that comes from knowing you have done something difficult but necessary. In the days that followed, Pierce found himself thinking often about Rob, about the choices we make when we are afraid, and about how those choices can echo through an entire lifetime. He thought about his own losses, his own regrets, and how telling the truth, even when it hurts, is sometimes the only way to honor the people we love. Rob's last confession had not erased the past, but had given it a new shape, one that included accountability, sorrow, and a quiet longing for redemption. And somewhere beyond the noise of Hollywood, beyond the headlines and the myths, there was a simple human story left behind, a story about a man who made a terrible mistake, who carried it in his heart until it broke him, and who in his final moments tried to give the world one last, fragile gift of honesty. In that truth, painful and imperfect as it was, there lived a small, trembling hope that even in our darkest failures, we can still reach for the light.